Hello and welcome to the Hawaii Tropical Fruit Growers presentation on World Banana Tour. My name is Gabriel Sachter-Smith. I am a farmer and banana researcher on the North Shore of Oahu. I have spent the last 17 years of my life studying bananas, both in Hawaii and in many countries abroad. And today I'm going to be hopefully showing some interesting photos and experiences of a portion of the banana traveling that I've done. There's always more to share. There's always aspects and diversity that there isn't time for, but I hope that this will give a general eye-opening exposure of a lot of different types of bananas that you may or may not have been aware of before. So let's start with what exactly is a banana plant. It's a member of the family Musaceae. They're native to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. There's 3 genera, Musa, Musella, and Ensete, comprising about 100 species, and botanically, they're fairly closely related to heliconias, gingers, birds of paradise, a few other groups of plants, which you can see in this graphic, which, although relatively outdated and inaccurate, is at least an interesting and somewhat loosely accurate representation of at least the group of plants that are related. This is essentially the order Zingiberales, which includes bananas and those other plants that I mentioned. Back in a time when scientific botanical literature had a little bit more art to it. So I just like using this graphic as a rough representation, although a lot of the names on it are incorrect and not used anymore. So let's start with the genus Ensete. There's about 8 species recognized. There's a little bit of taxonomic uncertainty, as always. They're native to Asia and Africa. Unlike Musa, which we'll get to in a bit, they flower only once and then completely die. And there are, in fact, domesticated forms of it that are eaten as food, particularly in Ethiopia, especially Ensete ventricosum. These are just some ornamental plants that are often planted in landscapes and even throughout the mainland U.S. and in Europe in the summer. But domesticated forms of this species, Ensete ventricosum, is called Ensete, and the corms and the inner pseudostems are eaten. Starch is extracted from them, and they're made into various types of breads and other starchy foods. The leaves are used for cooking in and as cattle fodder. So there's a whole really interesting culture and agricultural system around them that I would love to be able to study one day, but I'm going to have to go to Ethiopia for that. I haven't gotten that opportunity yet, unfortunately. Another species of Ensete that's relatively common is Ensete superbum. It's an Asian species, native to India and Thailand. Just to kind of give a perception of that, Ensetes, although they are rather banana-like, they have some really distinct, unique traits about them. These 2 photos actually show the same species, superbum. On the left is in Hawaii, on the Hamakua coast. This plant is about 20 feet tall, flowering. You can see the large flower bunch emerging way up high at the top of the plant. But they're really adaptable and actually grown in containers. This is at the National Botanic Garden in Washington, D.C. This plant's only about 3 feet high. So they make an interesting ornamental plant as well. They don't really have any particular strong use. Maybe they're used as animal fodder, or the leaves are used, or some parts medicinally in their where they're native to, but generally they're just planted as ornamentals if they're outside their native range. Ensete glaucum is a very wide-ranging Asian species of Ensete, all the way from India throughout to Papua New Guinea. And it actually does have some uses. The fruit and seeds are used medicinally, like a lot of wild bananas, especially in the regions around northern Vietnam and northern Laos and southern China. They're usually made into alcohol infusions, and sometimes are cultivated also for animal fodder. You can see the fruit here actually has a fair amount of pulp with an interesting kind of pinkish coloration throughout it. And although to me it's a bit astringent, it kind of tastes like Smarties candies. They're actually quite tasty. These fruits were sold at a market in northern Laos, I believe, for those medicinal uses. And just to mention again, Ensete are truly monocarpic, so they flower only once and then completely die. There are no suckers produced. This is a plant that had been, of course, flowered, and now it's degenerating back. They're normally propagated by seed, although that first species, Ensete ventricosum, can be propagated by a special type of induced suckering, but they don't normally do it without human intervention. So the next genus, Musella, there's only one species recognized currently, Musella lasiocarpa, which variously has been described as a musa and an Ensete. Genetically, they're actually quite closely related to Ensete. So if they were to be reclassified again one day, they'd probably be an Ensete. The difference between them and Ensete mainly is that they do actually form true suckers and will form long-lived mats. They're native to China and Vietnam, but the populations in the wild are almost completely extinct. They're extremely, extremely rare in the wild, and have mostly been held around, though, as ornamental plants and as animal feed. They're grown as for mostly pig feed in higher elevation areas of Yunnan, China, and in some areas in Vietnam. They are very cold-hardy plants. They can grow in areas with annual snow. They're grown as ornamentals often in the mainland U.S. in cold areas. They'll die back in the winter and come back in the spring. And the typical classic form of it has this bright yellow, long-lived bud. Another name for it is the golden lotus banana. And in some traditions of Buddhism, especially in Yunnan, it is incorporated into some of the traditional imagery and customs there as a golden lotus. So golden lotus banana is, or the golden lotus in those traditions is actually a banana, this Musella lasiocarpa. A few years ago, a new unknown population of wild plants was actually found in Sichuan, north of Yunnan in China. And it was named a variety rubribracteata for the reddish bracts, and they're very, very beautiful plants. And they have a little bit different habit than the classic Musellas in that they don't sucker quite as much, and they form these sort of monolithic statue-like pillars of a plant. And they only get about 2 or 3 feet tall, and then we'll make this really beautiful flower that can bloom for months and months. And so some breeders in China are actually trying to develop them into these kind of living statue plants, something you could put out on your front doorstep or a business as sort of a plant sculpture, I like to think of it as. You can actually dig them up while they're flowering and transplant them, and they'll just keep going. They usually lose all their leaves. You can see on the left here are some of the more classic types. So these are actually all hybrids that they've been making with them to try to produce the perfect ornamental plants. You can see these large fields of all of these different seedlings that they're selecting for, lots of different colors. This is just a selection when I got the tour of the breeding program in Yunnan. All the different colors and sort of bud formations as viewed from the top. They're really stunning plants, and hopefully one day they could be available outside of China, but no clue if or when that will ever happen. One other interesting thing about Musellas is that they're the only species in the whole family that regularly will make multiple inflorescences, kind of like some gingers, from leafless sort of secondary shoots around the base of the plant, and sometimes they can come out of the petiole bases, occasionally even having double flower heads, but it's a normal trait for Musella. So if you're lucky enough to have a plant that does this too, it will bloom even longer. You can see this photo on the left. The fruit bunch is actually almost mature and the primary bud is nearly degenerated, but it'll continue to bloom for months and months. Some of them can bloom for up to 2 years even, just continuously. So really fascinating, pretty little plants. So now we're going to focus on the genus Musa. This is the one that is the most common type of banana. When you think of a banana, it's probably a Musa. There's about 80 species or so recognized, although that's a constantly changing number. They're native mostly to Asia, but some into the Western Pacific. And there's currently 2 subgenera, Musa and Callimusa. There formerly were 5, which you can see on this graphic to the right. They're rough ranges, but recent genetic and some morphological analysis has indicated that really there's just 2 primary groups. The Musa, which are the classic Musa, and then the Callimusa, which mean the beautiful Musa, and we'll learn more about those later. So the Musa section of the genus Musa includes the majority of edible bananas. There's about 40 species recognized, and they were formerly split into 2 sections, the U Musa and the Rhodochlamys. Here's a classic species, Musa velutina, a really little pretty species from India. Only grows a few feet tall. It has pink fuzzy fruits that self-peel when they're ripe. Other former Rhodochlamys species include Manii, Ornata, Laterita. See lots of different bracts colors. They're often used for ornamental landscaping projects or even grown as cut flowers for bouquets. And there's been actually a fair amount of breeding work to produce new ornamental varieties of these as well. I was really fortunate to be on a trip where in Yunnan, China, we found one of the first wild populations ever recorded of a more recently described species, Musa rubinia. It was only described from cultivation before. It's not unusual that someone might find a wild plant, bring it home, grow it in their garden, and then a scientist comes across it as a new species, and they might not be able to find any plants in the wild, but they can still describe the species. But we were really fortunate to find some of the first wild populations in Yunnan, and we found both red and orange forms, and upon further analysis, they're probably the same as Manii, but that's going to take some heavy taxonomic revision. So for now, they're just rubinia still. So another little pretty, would have been former Rhodochlamys species, but now they're Musa section. Another really interesting species, wild species, Musa itinerans. They are probably the most common wild banana in Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, Northeast India, southern China, and Yunnan. And what's interesting about them is although the fruit is completely seeded and like any wild banana doesn't really have much edible pulp, the plant itself is actually used for a lot of different things, and a lot of parts of it are eaten as a vegetable. And the name actually comes from it being sort of itinerant in that it is going on a tangent all the time. That's how I like to think of it. They have really long rhizomes that can spread up to 5 meters away. And so when you see mats of them or groves, they look like a forest of a bunch of different plants, but most of them are actually all connected underground. And they can spread over really large areas. I've seen patches in the wild that will cover mountainsides, be, dozens and dozens of acres that are primarily just itinerans. Like I said, the plants are used for a lot of non-fruit uses. The flower buds just cut up raw. They're not astringent like a lot of other bananas that might need salt or vinegar soaking. They can just be eaten just as they are. They make a quite nice and popular salad. The fruit is infused into alcohol for a really popular pre or post meal medicinal, I've been told, although I'm not sure, libation, as well as the inner pseudostems eaten as a common vegetable too. The whole plant is not astringent like a lot of bananas, so you can eat it fresh. It's almost something like celery. It's quite nice. And itinerans was actually the plant used for the first and only time that I've ever had a dish made from banana leaves. This is the young inner leaf while it's still rolled up inside the plant before it's been exposed to the sun, cut up kind of like noodles in Yunnan, China, and I kind of describe it as somewhere between salad and spaghetti. It's quite good though. I would grow itinerans just to try all these different uses, but I don't know where to put it on my farm because once you plant it, it'll take over a huge area, and if it gets virus or something, it might be quite hard to get rid of. Another interesting species I've had the pleasure of documenting is Sikkimensis, which is normally only known to be native to India, but on a recent trip we definitely documented populations in Yunnan, China. Some that were very close to the classic Sikkimensis that's well known, but others that were a bit more confusing. One distinct trait, which isn't totally unique to Sikkimensis, but a bit different from other wild bananas, is that they have really thick, hard seeds that are exceptionally tough. I mean, some wild bananas, you can eat the fruit, and it's maybe not the best experience because of the seeds, but you can get through it. These are like rocks, about 1 centimeter wide, and very hard in the seeds. They also tend to lose their leaves as they flower. They grow also in high elevation areas. We found a number of different forms that may or may not be Sikkimensis. They're totally new, undocumented banana varieties. Some had been previously classified as other species, mistakenly, like different varieties of those species, but some have never been classified or documented, so we got some work to do as far as figuring out what they are. Luckily, we're able to take plenty of leaf samples, and all that's being worked on now by my colleagues. But this is just to show some of the other diversity of wild bananas throughout southern China and Yunnan. Like I mentioned before, they grow at really high elevations, and it's kind of interesting to see them growing in areas where you wouldn't expect bananas, among conifers and rubus and flowering cherries and plums. And they actually do not grow well at all in lower elevation areas. They need cold in order to thrive. Kind of like the itinerans, though, they are used in that area for some non-fruit uses. Here we had collected a female flower bud that we had for dinner that night. Just the whole thing chopped up with the flowers and young fruits in there. Quite delicious, but typically only used for those kinds of uses. It wasn't clear to us if some of them were actually cultivated or wild. It seems to be that there's a mix of them and quite a lot of different varieties, so it's a whole nother mystery to unravel there. The next wild species we're going to talk about, which is getting somewhat more important to understanding edible bananas, is Musa balbisiana. It's the secondary ancestral parent to many edible bananas. So its genetic makeup is in a lot of edible bananas, but not in all of them. And it's actually quite rare in the wild because it's so widely cultivated for a lot of non-fruit uses, kind of like these other species, either as animal feed, as cordage. The fibers are used to make various forms of cloth or rope. The leaves are thick and used for cooking. The flower buds are eaten, so it's actually very widespread, and there's a lot of different forms that aren't well understood. But it's made its way into edible bananas. There are actually domesticated balbisiana as well, especially in throughout northern Vietnam, into Laos, and in western India, or actually, northeast India. They tend to have larger fruits with a fair amount of pulp. You can see on the right here compared to the wild type on the left. But what's interesting is that the seeds don't form completely and they stay kind of soft. And you can eat the fruit and it's okay, but typically they're still just made into these different medicinal kind of treatments. You're infused in alcohol or used for various uses. When I had first read about this many years ago, I had kind of thought like, okay, it's sort of a minor thing, maybe it's just something in the village level. But I was really shocked when we were touring northern Vietnam and seeing just how prevalent it was. At almost every single restaurant, they had this wild banana-infused alcohol. It seemed like every little town had a village balbisiana dealer. This is a shop here with a whole heap of these domesticated balbisiana bunches getting ready to process them. So it's actually quite a common thing. I was really surprised. The exact status of this plant is a little bit unknown still, like if it's how domesticated it is. It seems that people only replant it and that this by suckers, that the seeds are completely inviable. But it's an interesting kind of subcategory of domestic bananas that isn't completely well understood yet, and also how it might relate to edible bananas is unclear. So now we are at the primary ancestral parent to the edible bananas, which is Musa acuminata. There's actually a lot of different forms of acuminata, over 20, I believe, described forms. This is just a small sample of the primary ones that have contributed, are known to have mostly contributed to the edible bananas, variety Zebrina, subspecies Malacensis, and subspecies banksii. And, they look quite different from themselves, so there's an argument that they could all be their own species as well, but for now they're all considered one species with just subspecies and varieties. Banksii, though, is probably one of the most interesting. It's native to Papua New Guinea. It makes very large bunches with quite large fruit, and it seems to be the species that is most commonly still influencing the domestication and the evolution of edible bananas, especially in New Guinea. There's a number of types that are somewhere between wild and cultivated. They might cross with cultivated things in gardens, and new seedlings come up. So, the evolution and the diversity of bananas is still being generated today. On the right, we actually found a really interesting specimen. There's one population of banksii that is growing in Samoa. It's a little bit different than most of them in New Guinea, though it's certainly from New Guinea at some point. But the question is, how did it get there? Was it introduced by humans? Was it introduced by animals? We don't know. The name in Samoa is Fe'i of Samoa, which means the bird poop banana, because the birds will eat it and spread it around. And in talking with people there, it's interesting. Some folks have claimed that they do eat them sometimes, or they ate them in the past during famines, or that they will deliberately plant them around farms and gardens to attract bats or other birds for hunting. So they do have some type of use. One interesting thing we found in Samoa was a particular specimen, which you can see this arrow pointing to on the top right, that was parthenocarpic, which is the first step to being an edible banana. It had very few seeds and was able to form its fruit fully without being fully pollinated. We know that this happens. It's something like this would have been the very first plant that somebody found and decided to collect a sucker from and replant in their garden as kind of one of the first edible bananas. But it was really exciting to find something like this essentially in the wild, and to think like, wow, something like this could cross with another plant and generate a new variety. And, that's how edible bananas came to be, which comes to this graphic, which is really, in some ways, overly complex, and in other ways, not nearly complex enough. But it is a good conceptual starting point. If you take the time, maybe you can pause it later and study it if you want to. But the base point that I would be trying to make here is that the evolution of bananas from the wild to the edible forms is still not fully understood. It's rather complex. There's multiple species involved, a lot of unknown factors that may have influenced them still. And it's something that we're still trying to learn about today. So starting from there, we actually have a system of classifying edible bananas that's different from a standard classification system for wild plants. We've been talking about Musa acuminata and Musa balbisiana. Those are the names that we give to the wild species only. But for edible varieties, there's actually a different taxonomic system that's based on the genome groups. And what they are based off of is the relative contribution of Musa acuminata and Musa balbisiana typically. They can exist at different ploidy levels, ploidy meaning the number of sets of chromosomes, and the relative contribution of each of those species. Now, so you'll often see if you're researching bananas or even just casually looking up some stuff, things that there might be AA or AAA or AAB or ABB. There's all kinds of different combinations. And that just has to do with how many sets of chromosomes came from each of those ancestral species, acuminata or balbisiana. And although this groupings does give you some type of understanding, it really doesn't mean much for the plants. Different AA varieties could have nothing to do with each other, not share any traits, so it only goes so far. But generally, we look at edible bananas in these three categories: diploid, triploid, and tetraploid. The diploids, they tend to be more slender. They often have more upright leaves, and they're usually a bit smaller. Some can be large, but they are often thought of as the more primitive type edible bananas, and very few of them are grown commercially for export or anything like that, but there's a lot of different diversity of them at the local level in areas where they're native to. Triploids, these are the most widespread and common type. They tend to be a bit more robust than diploids. They tend to have more horizontal leaves, a little bit higher yields, but again, it varies by the exact cultivar. But triploids definitely have seemed to be the most successful form of edible banana for spreading throughout the world. Pretty much all of the edible bananas that have made a big impact outside of their native range, so they may have been taken by boat or over land, thousands of years ago. They made it to Africa, they made it to Hawaii. Those usually were all triploid varieties that tended to be a bit more robust. And then finally, there are tetraploids. Now, up until somewhat recently, tetraploids were only thought to be produced in breeding programs. If you make enough forced crosses, you'll get a certain amount of tetraploids. But there are very few number of naturally occurring tetraploids. This is one that we documented in Papua New Guinea called buka, and they tend to be very large, almost comically large and exaggerated plants. It's hard to give a scale on this photo, but these leaves are probably about 4 or 5 feet wide and 10 to 15 feet long, and they're so large that they're drooping and almost touching the ground. So you can tell that there's a little bit something extra going on in those. So once we have the genome group and the ploidy levels, understood, what we really want to know about a plant is the subgroup. Now, the concept of a subgroup is imperfect, but it's a group of cultivars which all mutated from an original single seedling. The reality is that not all cultivars are yet assigned to a subgroup, and some might never be assigned to a subgroup. Maybe there isn't a group. Maybe it's just that one variety that was one seedling and it never really diversified or was selected upon. But what's really useful about the subgroup concept is that all the cultivars within a subgroup are very closely related, and we can infer different traits about them. And the details between them tend to be small. They might differ in height or pigmentation, things like that, but things like disease resistance or fruit quality would all be the same within a subgroup. So now we're going to look at some of the classic subgroups of bananas and hopefully also go on a few tangent explorations related to them based on my travels. So Sucrier is probably the most common diploid subgroup of banana. It has a lot of different names. Nino, ladyfinger, it's one of the many ladyfinger bananas. Datil, and it is the common banana that you might see in a grocery store sold as baby bananas or mini bananas. It's actually the Sucrier. Interestingly, one variety did make it to Hawaii in the old days, and that's our Mai'ahapai, the pregnant banana. Here in this photo, it's not pregnant, but this is what it looks like when it fruits normally, and it's actually a Sucrier. They have some really distinct coloration, this kind of brown mottling on the upper pseudostem that typically gives them away. A relatively less well-known subgroup of diploids is the Mchare. Now, this one is interesting because it's actually been found to be an ancestral parent of Cavendish, Gros Michel, and Pome bananas, which are three of the most popular and widely grown edible bananas in the world. I have a few varieties that I maintain in my collection, Muwaru Mchare, Hutishuma Nielu. They, to me, have some of the highest quality, most delicious fruit. Now, I tend not to be picking favorites when I talk about my favorite banana varieties because there's so many aspects that go into it, and at the end of the day, I'm really just interested in the diversity itself. But the Mchares, I think, have some potential. You can see on the right here, they have the capacity to make really large bunches of really large, high-quality fruit. Probably their one setback is that they ripen kind of green, so it takes a little bit of training. But as soon as people figure out how to figure out when they're ripe, when they are aromatic and they have a little bit of a softer texture and they're peelable, they tend to be very well appreciated. So I'm trying to grow a lot more of these and maybe even develop a small following in Hawaii for them. As I mentioned before, not all bananas are easily classified into the subgroup system. In Papua New Guinea, this is probably the most apparent, where there are so many, hundreds and hundreds of different domesticated diploids that they don't really fit. It's a bit of a puzzle. How do they all relate to each other? We just don't know. DNA analysis can only go so far. It lumps them all together in this kind of big group that's sort of loosely related with some outliers. But so at this point, it's almost like forget what the subgroup system is, just appreciate the diversity for what it is. And there's so many different forms, almost every color, shape, size that you can imagine probably exists somewhere in New Guinea. And so here are just a few more photos. It's hard to say anything particular about all of them. You just kind of got to stand back and, look at the diversity and just accept it for what it is. It could take a lifetime or more to really make sense of it all. But it's probably one of the most exciting things that I've been able to do is be able to explore for these and try to find new ones. A few that we've come across, just to highlight some differences, some really short ones. This is a puka biang on the left. It only grows about 2 to 3 feet tall. Pagal on the right makes huge fruits, and these are both diploids as well. So even though diploids are kind of like on the left, normally thought to be shorter, smaller, weaker plants, there's still a lot of potential, especially for breeding, or even some varieties that might be usable directly, like this pagal on the right that can make very large, really delicious fruits. This is a very unique form. There's only 2 varieties in the world that I know of that have this trait. A typical banana might or has its fruit arranged in hands, discrete hands that go down the bunch. But this mutation, which is relatively rare as a plant, even in New Guinea, where it's native to, has one continuous hand that is in a spiral all around the bunch. And as a result, too, it also has one continuous bract that will just tear itself off in a spiral as it goes. And let's take a closer look here. Really cool. A few different names for that plant. They usually all just mean spinning or spiraling. Now, this group of bananas is something that we came across in New Guinea over a couple different trips that, to my knowledge, has not been documented officially at all ever before, which is a bit surprising because they were relatively common in gardens, especially in the outer islands. We found most of these in Bougainville and West New Britain. Our genetic analysis shows that they have a mysterious origin. They seem to potentially be coming from a species that is not itself documented yet. We're not sure. But what we do know is that they're really beautiful. We found 5 distinct forms that have, really all in themselves interesting, beautiful leaf patterns. And I just call them the red leaf group. They don't make edible fruit, it seems. They very rarely flower, if at all. But when they do, there's almost nothing there. So they're really just grown as an ornamental plant for the leaves, and they are a really special site, especially this one on the right I'm just calling rainbow variegated. It has some of the most beautiful leaves, I think, of any banana that I've come across. So the Cavendish subgroup, we're moving on to triploids now. Cavendish is one of the most widely grown bananas in the world. It's estimated that about 50% of all bananas grown in the world are Cavendish. It makes up almost the entirety of the export industry, which the export industry itself is only about 15% of less of global production. However, there's a lot of Cavendish that are also grown for local markets. Cavendish is often thought of as a monolithic, single variety, and it's kind of true in that the entire subgroup is more or less just slight mutations from, that one original seedling. However, there are really distinct forms, and there is some, at least, phenotypic diversity within Cavendish. And this is also just to highlight, what can the differences be within a subgroup. For every banana variety you think there's certainly a whole slew of different varieties that are closely related relatives. Here we have 3 different height variations within Cavendish: a tall Cavendish type, Robusta, the dwarf Cavendish. Robusta might get 10 to 12 feet, dwarf Cavendish perhaps 4 to 6 feet, a super dwarf Cavendish, which usually gets 2 to 3 feet tall. We have other different variations that might occur. The yellow bud in this variety from Costa Rica. Black plants. This one is kind of commonly grown actually as a even commercial variety in Yunnan, China. And then the double Cavendish. This one makes multiple bunches, or can make multiple bunches from the once it fruits, but it also has a really unique kind of leaf pattern where it looks more like a traveler's tree than a banana. And I just would like to interject here also about that Cavendish really deserves respect. It's a bit of a popular thing in the banana adjacent world these days to bash Cavendish, saying that they're boring, that they're this junk banana, that there used to be a better one, the Gros Michel, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that, they're considered sort of a trash banana. However, I would like to make the case that Cavendish is one of the most amazing banana plants that really deserves a lot of respect. If you think about it, Cavendish bananas are an unimproved, old, essentially heirloom variety. They have not been bred commercially for the export industry. There's been some mutations selected from tissue culture, but it's really, really minor stuff. But the Cavendish bananas that you buy in a grocery store anywhere in the world are essentially the exact same plant that's been growing in Vietnam and Laos and China for thousands of years. So if you think about what it takes for a plant like that to be selected in a traditional context, being this old, essentially heirloom variety that's made it to the global stage as the most economically important banana in the world, there's something really special about that plant. And it's not because it's a bad plant. It's because it's a really amazing plant. So you might think that there's better fruit, and that's okay, or that there's more interesting bananas. But Cavendish, I would say, just deserves some respect. On the right here, we have a little family buying some bananas at a market in China, and these are all just locally grown, from the area right there. They are not export bananas. This is the equivalent of Hawaiian maia, essentially, in Hawaii, or other traditional varieties. This is one of their long-standing old traditional varieties. So now we'll move on to Gros Michel. This is another subgroup that has, it's somewhat closely related to Cavendish, actually, and it's famous for being the commercial banana predecessor to Cavendish. So when banana started to be grown as a large crop for export in the 1800s, it was Gros Michel, and it was pretty much the standard variety up until about the 1950s and 60s when it was replaced by Cavendish. But even within Gros Michel, there's a number of different varieties. We have here on the left classic Bluefields, which is the local name in Hawaii. It's a tall type of Gros Michel. The bend in the rachis below the bunch is a really classic trait of most Gros Michels. There's a few different dwarf forms, two of which I grow, Cocos and Highgate, which are pretty much equivalent, just shorter plants. What's nice about Gros Michels, although they're susceptible to a lot of different pests and diseases, they're actually one of the most spongy top tolerant varieties. So an interesting choice potentially for Hawaii growers, as long as you don't get too carried away with it, or because they are susceptible still to Fusarium wilt, which is what brought them down originally. Just some other different variations between the Gros Michel varieties. Bogoya, this is another one from East Africa. It's essentially the same as the tall Bluefields here. A distinct trait that is not only in Gros Michel, but if you're, say, in Hawaii and you find a plant with really distinct red margins, there's a good chance, or red margins on the petioles, I mean, there's a good chance that they could be Gros Michel. So the reds, they're another triploid AAA derived, so pure acuminata type variety. This subgroup is known for being red, but there are also green forms of it. Something that's funny about this red group is no matter where in the world you find it, because it's a pretty widespread banana, it always is just called red, usually in whatever the local language is. And I'm often asked for what's the more scientific or original real name of this plant, and it's really just red. Banana scientists, we call them red. Even the green form of it, which is probably the original form that the red one mutated from, is just called green red. So these are the red bananas. Another group of AAA, subgroup rather, is the Mutica lujugira. These are often also just called the East African highland bananas, and they are a very important staple crop in East Africa, in particular Uganda, where in some regions they are synonymous with food. So if you talk about food, you're talking about bananas. Normally they're called matoke and they're cooked. Uganda has the highest per capita banana consumption rate in the world, but it's typically these cooked matoke. You can see here the fruits are peeled and steamed, wrapped in banana leaves, tied with banana pseudostem fibers, and then they're mashed, and it comes out kind of like a mashed potato thing. I think it's quite good. Some people don't. Or foreigners don't, but it's the classic dish of Uganda. This subgroup, though, actually has a lot of different variations, and it's a really interesting case study in that bananas are not native to Africa. They were brought there. However, whatever original plants from this subgroup were brought, diversified over the last few thousand years into a really amazing set of different cultivars. On the left, we have something like Bakurura, which is sort of just typical looking, not very interesting. Mchare, which has very black, jet black pseudostems. Narwazinga, which is actually the only other plant other than that New Guinea spiraling banana that has the single spiraling hand. Musaceae alanda, the suckers shoot out at 45-degree angles, and the mat grows in all these different crazy directions. Namunwe, with very few but very large fruits. Nante, where all the fruits are fused together. And this also is an interesting example of the cultural context of bananas. A lot of varieties are planted not just for fruit, but also for ritual beliefs or different customary purposes. Nante, I was told, was planted often for the hope of getting twins. In Ugandan society, I'm told, or maybe some cultures within Uganda, having twins is considered a sign of very good luck, and it's a desirable thing. In this plant, because of the fused fruit, I guess maybe it reminds people of, the twin fruits are kind of like twin people, and so women would often plant these as sort of a prayer for twins. Bitambi, this plant is almost completely red. If you look on even the top sides of the leaves are red, so really ornamental, interesting plant. But this is just a small selection. There's probably about 80 different or so of these mutika that vary in all kinds of different ways. And the fruit is quite good when cooked, as mentioned before, but also can make okay dessert bananas sometimes. Anywhere in Uganda or lots of places in East Africa, this is a really common sight, just truckloads of bananas, being shuttled around. They are really the stand-in for wheat and rice as we might think of it in Western societies, or as kalo is to the Hawaiians, matoke is to the Ugandans. What's interesting, though, is in this society, even though it's this old traditional food, even in modern-day downtown Kampala, it's still this one of the staple foods that you might come across. So the culture is very alive and well for growing and eating these bananas. They also have a few different varieties called the Mbide, which means bitter varieties. They're thousands of years old too, but they're not preferred to be cooked or eaten. They have some bitterness and astringency to them, but they're used for brewing a type of beer, and they're brewed in these dugout canoe-like vessels. The fruit's mashed, juices extracted. It's mixed with some roasted sorghum and fermented. So another really interesting traditional use of them. Plantains. Let's talk about plantains for a minute. It's often thought that plantains are synonymous with any type of cooking banana, but it's not the case. Plantains are actually a very specific genetic group of banana, which is very diverse morphologically. There's probably at least 120 to 130 different varieties of plantains, and we can't go into all of them right now. But I will just give a brief overview of the three main types, which is the French type that has many fruits and tends to have a full, intact male axis. So on a banana plant, the fruits are typically the female flowers, and then it transitions to the male flowers. French type plantains kind of look like any other banana. But we have the false horn types, which just have a few fruits that are typically larger, but then the male bud degenerates quickly after the fruits are formed. And we have the horn types, which have typically just one, sometimes two hands of fruit, and then the male bud is completely absent. These are just a few. Like I said, there's many, many more. Plantains, although it's often thought of that, there's this distinction between bananas and plantains. Really, they're all bananas. Plantains are just a type of banana, but a very specific genetic group. The Maoli-Popo'ulu subgroup is the most relevant probably to the Pacific and to Hawaii. What's interesting about them is that they also follow the same type of morphological changes that you'll see in the plantains. They're not used in this subgroup yet, but the same type of forms. A French type like this Mangoro torotea from Aitutaki, a large bunch with a fully developed male bud. This Fe'i of Samoa aupupuka from Samoa is kind of like the horn type with fewer very large fruits and a quickly degenerating male bud. And then Wangevi from New Guinea, which is the first and only that maybe anyone has documented. On a recent trip, we found this essentially horn type Maoli banana. So quite interesting. It has one hand, very few but very large fruits. Within the Maoli-Popo'ulu, there's also two sort of basic forms, the Maoli type, which we're looking at here, and then the Popo'ulu type, which tend to be a little bit fatter and squatter. There doesn't seem to be as many varieties of the Popo'ulu, but really they're all closely related. Even the Popo'ulus are just slight variations from the Maolis. Some of them have larger bunches, like this Tanga from Aitutaki, compared to Akumo, which is fewer larger fruits, essentially equivalent to or perhaps the same plant as the Hawaiian Huamoa. But they're becoming increasingly rare, not just in Hawaii, but throughout the whole Pacific. Here's some fruits cooked by one of the mamas in Aitutaki. She was one of the last caretakers of any of the Popo'ulu types in Aitutaki in the Cook Islands. So they're becoming rare, but we were very lucky to find her, and she even shared some cooked fruit she had with us. Iholena is another subgroup, which is really important to Hawaii because it's probably the most diverse of the traditional Hawaiian bananas in Hawaii. We have the only dwarf type Iholena that I've yet seen in the Pacific. There are others, though, throughout, outside of Hawaii. These are two different ones, Laloki red and Sipik red from Papua New Guinea, which have some interesting red coloration in the fruits, and for Sipik red, an entirely red plant and red fruits as well. That Hawaiian dwarf Iholena, though, is a really fascinating plant. It's kind of special in that it's not only a Hawaiian variety, but it also is the only truly dwarf Hawaiian variety, which lends itself well to commercial production in that regard. And although it's susceptible to pretty much every pest and disease, it grows extraordinarily quickly. I've gotten crops in as little as 7 months from planting to harvest. And you can see here the same field from July through December. They have extraordinarily quick growth rate. And so that alone can kind of help them to not necessarily resist any pests or diseases, but completely outpace them. So that's something that I'm working on, trying to bring them to a wider audience through some modest commercial production. As we move through the ABB genomes of the subgroup diversity, here we have silk. Silk is a really popular banana throughout the world. It's a little bit confusing because they're often called apple bananas on the U.S. mainland or manzano, but they're different from the subgroup that we know as apple bananas, which are the pome. We have two main forms in Hawaii. I put here the non-Hawaii names because typically they're just called apple or dwarf apple in Hawaii, but some other names for them are Brazilian or prata, and for the dwarf, Santa Catarina prata or prata anya. They're good bananas, very popular throughout the world also, but they tend not yield as much as other varieties, and they can be a little bit slower in my experience. Mysore, this is a very popular banana in Samoa. This is a Fe'i of Samoa, which is essentially like their apple banana. It's the most common sweet dessert banana that you find in people's gardens and throughout markets, but it's actually native to India. Has very compact bunches, and you can identify it easily by the reddish underleaf. Bluego is a really common subgroup also. The variety in Hawaii that's common we call largo, but there's waxy forms with only two hands. It's actually a relatively diverse subgroup, and if you're ever on the U.S. mainland, especially in the south, throughout Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas, you actually can find bluego varieties that are, at this point, kind of an old traditional landrace. They've been cultivated for hundreds of years. They were brought by, I believe, Spanish explorers in the battle days, and they're very hardy plants. They can resist frosts. They can grow in less than ideal conditions, and they're very versatile fruit. They're gaining actually popularity recently too. Saba, this is a common one in Hawaii, has a few different names to pig, but also the praying hands. If you ever see this variety that has fused fruits, this is actually just a form of Saba. It's essentially the same plant. And this is also an interesting example to show that what we consider as cooking bananas versus edible bananas really has no specific difference biologically. It's really all about cultural preference. These Saba are typically considered as cooking bananas in their traditional context, but you allow them to ripen and sell them in another context, say these praying hands presented in this interesting cut manner. They're really quite tasty, and people don't have any problem accepting them as a dessert banana, at least from my experience in Hawaii. Pisang Awak, this is a really common subgroup, also called namwa. They're really hardy plants. But again, there's lots of different forms of them. The standard tall form that you might see on the left here has really waxy fruits and tends to be, fragile when ripe. But this fruit, or this form in the center that I have in my collection is I don't know the name of it, but it's a waxless form that makes larger bunches and even has a little bit better post-harvest handling traits. There's a dwarf form as well, which isn't quite as productive, but still relatively good choice, especially for backyard growers. I've been recommending it a lot lately. That's some diversity about the fruits. But actually, I think one of the most interesting overlooked parts to appreciate about banana plants is the male buds. This is a collection of varieties that aren't necessarily related in any particular way, other than that I was just trying to select out different interesting bud forms. A lot of times when people want their banana varieties ID'd, they'd already cut off the male buds, and that can make it really difficult because you can see the differences between these have a lot of information in them. What color the bracts are, what shape they are, how they roll or lift, what the flowers look like. These are all really important traits that we can use to identify varieties. So if you ever want your banana plant identified correctly, and you ask me, at least you should try to keep the male bud on. It really helps out. So if you remember from way back earlier in the presentation, we talked about musas and callimusas. These are the subsections of the genus Musa. So we're done with musas now, Musa section, and we're going to move on to the callimusas. So callimusa means the beautiful bananas. They have, as you might expect, some really beautiful buds and flowers. They tend to be really colorful. They're native mostly throughout Asia, in Borneo, peninsular Malaysia, throughout Indonesia, and then into Papua New Guinea. This is just a sampling of some different varieties. One group of them in particular that I've had the pleasure of studying up close a little better are the Vietnamese Callimusa, which aren't formally grouped yet as a known taxonomic identity, but they certainly seem to have some very strong affinities to one another. Coccinea, Hakinini, Lutea, Exotica, Splendida, Viridis, all really beautiful plants. They don't really have any currently known direct use as far as edible bananas goes, but they're often grown as ornamentals, either in gardens or as cut flowers. This is in Sapa in northern Vietnam. You will often see these wild Musa splendida cut for bouquets. These are just all wild harvested, so really beautiful plants. Maybe there's some potential for them as a new cut flower industry in Hawaii or elsewhere if they're ever able to be introduced. Musaceae, this is one that was formerly section Australimusa, now classified as a Callimusa. It is thought to be the probable ancestor to Fe'i bananas, which we'll get into next. But this is the wild species. So if you're familiar with Fe'i bananas, this is essentially a wild Fe'i. They're native to Papua New Guinea. They have upright, erect bunches, orange flesh, purple sap. Really, really common. They're like the most common default wild banana in a lot of parts of New Guinea, especially in the outer islands. And so they have a lot of interesting traits about them that have carried over directly into the Fe'i banana. So Fe'i are what we call this completely separate lineage of edible bananas that were domesticated from Musaceae. There's a lot of different cultivars, but they're not well understood. I've been fortunate to be involved in some projects over the last few years that we've been collecting different Fe'i throughout the Pacific and attempting to make some sense of them genetically and morphologically, but there's still a lot of work left to go. There's different forms like this limot from Bougainville, which has squatter, kind of rounder fruits. Taraka gata gata from the Solomon Islands, which has long, skinny fruits. Potia, which is a variety originally from Tahiti, but only remaining in Hawaii, it's thought, that has very large, round, ball-shaped fruits. These are some from Samoa, too. In the literature, it was thought that it appeared that there was maybe only one variety of Fe'i in Samoa, but when we got there, we actually found two very distinct types that people seem to distinguish between. Fe'i of Samoa and Fe'i Sawa'a. So just an interesting kind of differentiation. We don't know the full diversity of Fe'i, so it's always exciting to find them. But one place that it's not hard to find them and that there probably is a lot more diversity is in Rarotonga. Rarotonga seems to be one of the last places in Polynesia, at least, there's certainly places in New Guinea, but in Polynesia where there are really extensive old ancient Fe'i groves, which there are called utu. This is in Takuvaina Valley, which we explored for a while. It's a bit hard to see from this large photo, but mountainsides like this, as soon as you zoom in, you'll see these banana patches, and they almost are growing like wild bananas. They're actually all Fe'i that were planted, or utu rather, in Rarotonga. Utu that were planted who knows how long ago. The locals all describe that they go and collect them, but almost nobody plants them. Unfortunately, some pests and disease are starting to move in and starting to wipe them out, and without people replanting them, they're disappearing. It's always nice to find people that are still hanging on. This is Celine Dyer. She actually worked for the government there in the Cook Islands, but as a hobbyist, she is also an utu grower, and she is one of the very few people left that was actually actively replanting these different utu. And in her garden, she described at least 4 different varieties. We don't know if we found them all because some of them weren't fruiting, but we collected as much as we could. But most excitingly, she also described some varieties that they know from way up in the mountains that are now inaccessible, but we've slowly been thinking about a way to potentially do a trip back there and find these lost utu varieties that could be the last place they're left in the world, that are way up in the mountains on Rarotonga still. So, as always, more left to be discovered, or rediscovered, rather. Fe'i, like the Maoli-Popo'ulu, have purple sap or reddish sap, and when you cut them, it's almost like they're bleeding. And when they're ripe, the fruit is very, very dark orange or yellow, typically, very high in carotenoids, and one of the most delicious cooked banana experiences, in my opinion. Although they're really nutritious and they really deserve a lot of respect, the thing about Fe'i is they're rare for a reason, and it's because they're really difficult to grow. If you remember back from those slides I can just go back really quick. In Rarotonga, this is typically how they're traditionally grown, way up in the mountains, kind of left to their own. They're not wild plants, but they almost prefer to be grown like one. So, Fe'i are often sort of this magic thing just out of reach for a lot of banana growers because they're very finicky. But if you ever want to go on a really awesome Fe'i experience, I highly recommend Rarotonga. So we'll go back a little bit now to another wild species because it's relevant to our discussion on this evolution of the diversity of edible bananas, and talk about Musaschizocarpa. It's native to Papua New Guinea. Its name means splitting fruit. You can see here that the fruit splits open when it's ripe. And interestingly, it is a minor ancestral parent to some edible cultivars. And in New Guinea, it's made its way in. We can see here the left wild type Schizocarpa, very dark green fruits with a really distinct bottle nose on the tip. That trait kind of comes through in some of these other cultivars. This is a diploid AS cultivar, we're calling it, that has Schizocarpa heritage. And a few years ago, we also found the first triploid AAS, tentatively we're classifying it as, cultivar. What's interesting about them is they have a really distinct sour taste that must come from the Schizocarpa. They're typically cooked. They're okay raw. They're more interesting as just a kind of specimen oddity, in my opinion. They're not necessarily the best tasting, but I appreciate all the diversity for what they are anyway. We've talked about all these Musa section cultivars and now the Callimusa section. Probably the most interesting and misunderstood / completely unknown group of edible bananas are the intersectional outliers, as I'm calling them. There's a very small number of varieties existing, mostly in Papua New Guinea and the surrounding area, that seem to be actually hybrids between either Fe'i bananas or maybe the relatives of Fe'i bananas, like that Musaceae or other species, and acuminata-derived cultivars. Some of them actually taste somewhat like Fe'i, but grow like other bananas. They're existence theoretically shouldn't even exist because of some different genetic incompatibilities, but yet they do exist. So they're a really fascinating and mysterious group of edible bananas. And there's a few others as well that we have found in New Guinea that tend to be closely related to varieties that we know about, but are tetraploid versions that kind of have some foreign DNA in them. We're really excited to find out what they might hold for the future. Something like this in particular, this Pisang Awak-like tetraploid in the center, that's called buka, is kind of like the Pisang Awak or namwa that you might know and grow, but is even larger, more robust, more productive plant with a bit of a enhanced flavor, in my opinion. So, there's still a lot of interesting things out there, and we hope to explore and bring more to you. And on that note, that is what I have to share with you today. But the education and the learning and the following of my adventures doesn't have to end right now. You can follow me on Instagram at Hawaii Banana Source, or direct any questions you might have to me at gabe.sachter@gmail.com. I'm always happy to share what information I can, and also to share my fruits and plants. If you're on Oahu on the North Shore, you're welcome to contact me and come by sometime and check out what I got. And with that, I thank you very much and hope you enjoyed and learned something today.